Hello everybody, my name is Joseph Perez, and today I will be discussing the Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was a conflict that took place in the Pacific Theater towards the end of World War II. This battle had many major implications on the end result of the war. So without further ado, let's get into the presentation. Here are some of the topics I will be discussing in this presentation. First, I'll talk about the prior events that led up to the Battle of Okinawa. Many of these events were great battles fought throughout the Pacific Theater. I'll also give a brief overview of the battle itself. Additionally, I'm going to explain the importance of the battle for both sides of the conflict. I will outline the main events on a timeline and explain those events that occurred during the battle. I'm going to discuss the involved forces and the leaders of those forces from both sides, and also the strategies that they used during this battle. I will also talk about the losses that both sides experienced. Additionally, I'll mention the impact that Okinawan citizens felt as a result of the Battle of Okinawa. Finally, I'm going to talk about the aftermath of the battle and the legacy of the battle. Alright, here's a list of events that occurred prior to the Battle of Okinawa. So before World War II even really started, there was weakening relationships between the United States and Japan. This first occurred in the late 1930s and carried on into the 1940s. Japan went into fighting with China and went into imperialistic measures trying to take over Southeast Asia. The United States, however, was not fond of Japan's aggression. So as a result, they placed economic embargoes on Japan. Originally, the United States stayed neutral during World War II. However, that all changed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese snuck attack the Hawaiian base, devastating Pearl Harbor. As a result, the United States joined the war the very next day. Another significant event that happened was the Battle of Coral Sea. This was the first major naval engagement that was fought between two aircraft carriers. Another major battle that occurred was the Battle of Midway. This was a crucial naval conflict that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. The U.S. Navy defeated Japan's Navy and prevented New Zealand from being invaded by Japan. Finally, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a significant victory for the Allies. This victory paved the way for the Okinawan invasion. Here is a basic battle overview of the Battle of Okinawa. This was considered the last major battle of World War II. Originally, this was planned to be the final island battle before the potential invasion of the Japanese homeland. This was a fierce battle that covered all of the elements. It took place on land, sea, and even included aerial attacks. This grueling battle waged on for nearly 3 months, from April 1st, 1945 to June 21st, 1945, when it finally ended. Alright, here's a battle event timeline that shows all of the main events that occurred throughout the battle. So on April 1st, 1945, thousands of United States soldiers stormed the Okinawan shore. This officially marked the beginning of the Battle of Okinawa. On April 6th and 7th of 1945, Japan launches its first counterattack. So they used over 300 kamikaze planes, and they also made use of the battleship, the Yamato. The Yamato was sunk fairly quickly, although Japan thought they could defeat the Allies with it. On April 18, 1945, the Marines began to weaken Japanese defenses in northern Okinawa. Because of that, this allowed the Allies access to the rest of the island. On June 1st, 1945, the Shuri Castle, which was being well defended by the Japanese, falls after relentless attacks from the United States 10th Army. Just a few days later, on June 4th, 1945, the Allies are able to take over the Naha airfield, devastating the Japanese aerial forces. Finally, on June 21st, 1945, the United States officially captures Okinawa, allowing them to win the battle. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the importance of this battle for both the Allies and the Japanese. So to start, I'm going to discuss why the battle was important for the Allies. The Ryukyu Islands was a strategic location for the Allies. So the capturing of all of the islands would allow the Americans to occupy and build a base. Additionally, this move would cut Japanese ties to South Asia. As a result, Japan would become weakened as a nation, since they relied on these South Asian countries for their natural resources. Finally, taking over the land would set up an invasion of mainland Japan, which would definitely end the war. Now I will discuss the importance of the battle for Japan. Japan, on the other hand, wanted to prevent the Allies from occupying and building on the island of Okinawa, as well as taking over the other islands nearby. They needed to maintain their South Asian influence so that they could remain the powerful force they were during World War II. Like I said earlier, there were many natural resources found in this region that the Japanese relied on during the war. Finally, the Japanese desperately wanted to protect the homeland from being invaded and conquered by the Allied forces. They feared a complete Allied invasion and thought that they needed to stop them to avoid the harsh wartime punishments. Now I'm going to explain the involved forces from both sides of the conflict. So the involved forces for the Allies in the battle included a force containing well over 180,000 men. The force included a combination of the United States 10th Army and the United States Navy's 5th Fleet, as well as some other allies, such as the British. The 10th United States Army was commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. and contained members of both the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps. The 5th Fleet was directed by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Now I'm going to discuss the involved forces of Japan during the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese were largely outnumbered and only had about 75,000 soldiers, which is about 100,000 less than the United States and Allies deployed. About half of the Japanese force were conscripted Okinawan citizens that weren't even part of the army. They were added to the Japanese army to defend their island. The Japanese forces included the Japanese 32nd Army and the Imperialism Japanese Navy Combined Fleet. The 32nd Army was led by Mitsuru Ushijima. The Combined Fleet was commanded by Manoru Ada. At the beginning, it could be seen that Japan was in trouble and had a very low chance of winning this battle. The Japanese themselves knew that, so they used vicious attacks, which I'll discuss later on. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the leaders of these forces. So first off, for the Allies is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. He was appointed Lieutenant General on September 1944 and was the commanding general for the 10th Army. He was charged with the invasion of the Ryukyu Islands, and he had fought and won the last great battle in the Pacific. He was killed on June 18th, 1945, while he was visiting a forward observation post near the southwest tip of the island. Although the battle ended soon after his death, this was still a crucial impact on the Allied forces, as General Buckner was a well-liked general. The next Allied leader I will be talking about is Chester W. Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz was appointed the United States Pacific Fleet Commander-in-Chief and was appointed the same month as Pearl Harbor. During the Pacific theater, both land and sea forces were under Nimitz's authority. He commanded many crucial battles, including the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea in 1942, the Solomon Islands from 1942 to the 1943, the Gilbert Islands in 1943, the Philippines in 1944, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. He will forever be known as one of the most prominent naval commanders in history. Now we're going to discuss the leaders of the Japanese forces. So the first leader I'll be talking about from Japan is Mitsuru Ushijima. He was the commander of the 32nd Army, and he was stationed in southern Okinawa during the United States invasion. Ushijima preached to his army to fight as long as they can. Commander Ushijima refused to surrender even after his troops lost ground to the American forces. He committed ritual suicide to prevent himself from being captured on June 22nd, 1945. He did this after the final Japanese offensive attack failed. After his death, the battle immediately ended. The next leader from Japan I will be discussing is Manoru Ada. Ada was the commander of the Japanese Navy during the Battle of Okinawa. He led his troops of 10,000 men, half of which were conscripted civilian laborers. Even with the unexperienced fighters, Ada was able to lead a relentless resistance. He was able to lead a strong defense against the Allied invaders, but gradually fell back towards the Ryukyu Peninsula until they were completely surrounded by the Allies. On June 13th, 1945, his troops made one final charge of desperation against the Allies. This attack failed as the Japanese simply did not have enough troops to combat the Allies. After the failed last resort attack, Ada also committed suicide. Now I'm going to take a minute to discuss the military strategies that were used by both sides. The Allies had hoped to overwhelm Japan with constant attacks. They often utilized frontal assaults. This is when an enemy is attacked head-on and directly. This is known for being a high-risk, high-reward attack. It can be dangerous because many men are put at risk just to achieve a victory. The Allies often advanced in waves every day and attacked using heavy artillery. The United States and Allies were well supplied with high-quality weapons. Some of these weapons included the flame-thrown tank. Ideally, the Allies would quickly take over the island, which would allow them to establish an airbase. This airbase would allow them to prepare for the invasion of mainland Japan before it's commenced. Now I'll go into the military strategies that were used by Japan. Japan's goal was to prevent what seemed like an inevitable United States invasion. They hoped that their kamikaze planes would destroy the U.S. fleet, preventing the invasion from happening. Hundreds of these planes were used, and they were able to successfully destroy many Allied ships and aircrafts. The destruction of the Allied ships and aircrafts was not enough, however, and the Japanese army still had to resort to other forms of combat. The Japanese made use of the caves that were found in Okinawa. They hid in them to shelter and protect them from any American or Allied attack. Japan's tendency to be feisty and unwilling to surrender showed with the boldness of the Japanese strategy. The kamikaze planes are a good example of this characteristic. The brutality of the Battle of Okinawa caused many losses from both sides. The Allies, although they won the battle, still suffered a large number of casualties. They had about 12,000 men who were killed in this battle. 36,000 were wounded. Additionally, the United States lost Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who was killed in action. Although they would win the battle just a few days later, this was still a devastating loss for the Allies. In addition to that, the United States lost a lot of equipment because of the Japanese kamikaze attacks. The Fifth Fleet had 368 ships that were damaged and 36 that were completely sunk. They also had about 5,000 men who were killed or drowned because of the attacks. 5,000 more men were wounded, and they also suffered a loss of about 760 aircraft. So even though the Allies dominated the battle, they still had to sacrifice many men and their equipment. Now for the losses the Japanese experienced. Japan was the big loser in this battle, as it was their homeland that they were defending. So they experienced much more destruction. Japan had lost about 110,000 men throughout the battle. They only had 7,000 soldiers who surrendered. Both commanders Ushijima and Commander Otto both committed ritual suicide before the battle ended, just so that they could avoid capture and the potential punishments the Allied forces would give to them. Many Japanese soldiers and civilians did the same exact thing, fearing what would happen to them if they surrendered. Japan had also lost a lot of equipment due to the brutal nature of the battle. They had lost over 1,000 planes, mostly as a result from their own kamikaze attacks. The island of Okinawa was completely destroyed due to the battle. This devastated the people who were living there. Overall, the Japanese suffered a massive loss during this battle. They lost a lot of manpower as well as their proficient equipment. They would have a tough time recovering and preparing for the attack on their own mainland. Alright, now for the civilian impact from the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese widely used propaganda to scare their own citizens and encourage them to do whatever it took to avoid surrender. They often depicted the Allies as an unethical and brutal enemy who wouldn't hold back on any form of punishment. The United States bombardment of the island also impacted the citizens of Okinawa. The destruction caused by the constant attacks made the island virtually uninhabitable. Many citizens, including children, became soldiers for the Japanese army. About 2,000 students, for example, were used to help defend Okinawa. Unfortunately, only half of them survived. Okinawans also committed suicide because of the fear instilled by them from the Japanese propaganda. Also, it was mandated by the Japanese army, and they were forced to commit suicide. Obviously, the overall population of Okinawa also decreased dramatically. It declined by about a quarter of what the population was before the battle started. Anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawan citizens died from the battle, either by being in the army, the crossfire on the island, or by ritual suicide. The civilians of Okinawa were massively impacted by this fierce battle. This was a horrific event that impacted the whole island. I will now mention the aftermath of the Battle of Okinawa. So after the battle concluded, the United States occupied the island and constructed airfields. The island contained heavy United States presence until it was returned to Japan on May 15th, 1972, nearly 30 years after the battle. Rebuilding occurred on the island post-war, leading to better infrastructure. However, due to the American influence, Okinawan citizens were heavily exposed to American culture. This would separate Okinawa from Japan, angering many Japanese. The Battle of Okinawa put the Allied forces within striking distance of mainland Japan. However, due to the outcome of the battle, the Allies estimated that they would lose as much as 1 million men if they carried out an invasion on Japan. They wanted to bring a swift end to the war and did not think this invasion would be logical. After the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman took his place. President Truman decided to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was first hit on August 6, 1945. A few days later, Nagasaki was hit on August 9th, 1945. The next week, on August 15th, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, putting an official end to World War II. So as you can see, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Okinawan Island post-World War II. Even though Japan now occupies the island again, there's still American presence. And this is grounds for even more controversy. Finally, I'm going to discuss the legacy of the Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was a crucial victory for the Allied forces. Occupying the island provided them with options that would end the war. The Battle of Okinawa will be remembered as a mass casualty conflict. Both sides, the Allies and the Japanese, lost thousands of men and equipment during this battle. The stark death count is a reminder of how devastating war can be when both sides fight until the very end. The Allies will not stop until they conquer the island, while the Japanese were unwilling to surrender and gave it all they had. The battle granted the United States, as well as its allies, the ability to invade mainland Japan, although they never carried out this invasion. The battle likely quickened the end of the war because the first atomic bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. After 1945, an atomic bomb has not been used in a conflict since. So you could see the legacy that this battle carries on even today. It is interesting to see the destruction caused by these atomic bombs, scaring people from using them in the modern day. That's why you don't see nuclear warfare, as of now at least, as it's pretty much a standoff between the world powers. Alright, so for closing, I would like to thank everybody for watching this video. I learned quite a bit while researching this topic. There's a lot of things I was unaware of before I further looked into it. And I hope that you guys can take away some things as well. For example, I didn't realize how close the United States was away from Japan at the end of the war. And it's interesting to think about what would happen if the United States launched a full-on invasion on the mainland of Japan. I hope everyone learned a lot about the Battle of Okinawa and are now aware of its significance as well as the events that it has caused, such as the United States occupation and military presence. This battle is a reminder of the mass destruction that can be caused by war. Hopefully, we can develop world peace and prevent another world war from happening in the future. I hope everyone has a great day. Farewell. Thank you.